Well, look at these two. Unapologetically brutish looks created by Ford's Rally Sport division. In my eyes, this is what a hot hatch should be. Proper Recaro buckets, 3 pedals, hard suspension, and a properly naughty engine. The Mark II was fitted with a 2.5 litre 5-cylinder warbler of an engine. Stock, these cars made 300 brake horsepower and 440 Newton meters of torque. Very impressive for the time. However, this car has had a plethora of mods, taking it to 380 brake horsepower and many, many more torques. All that power goes through the front wheels and is harnessed by a mechanical quaife differential. The Mark III goes with a more efficient 2.3 litre 4-cylinder unit that cracks and bangs because more noise equals more better. With 350 brake horsepower and 475 Newton meters of torque, it'll be quite interesting to find out whether it'll be able to keep up with the heavily modded Mark II. In fact, let's see who wins the 30 to 70 sprint. As you can see, the difference in performance is actually pretty staggering. The Mark II managed a 30 to 70 time of just 4.48 seconds, and to put that in perspective, that's exactly as quick as the new Mercedes A35 AMG. And remember, that car's got a dual clutch gearbox and a wider power band. The Mark III, although it feels quick, it doesn't seem to cut the mustard. With a time of just 5.29, it's certainly not as quick as I was hoping. A lot of that is going to be due to the all-wheel drive system and drivetrain loss. Whilst it helps grip at lower speeds, once you're moving, all it does is suck power from the engine. And yes, I know the Draggy says the run is invalid. However, we do run these tests on exactly the same bit of road. Sometimes Draggy just seems to think we're going downhill. The Mark II certainly shows its age, but you have to admit there's something quite charming about a relatively simple cabin. No buttons on the steering wheel, and Recaro seats tell you that this car is meant for one thing, and for one thing only: to unleash the boy racer inside. It may not be luxurious, but it still has 2 cup holders, air conditioning, and a fairly decent sound system. The Mark III, although newer, continues the general theme from the Mark II. Both cars have dash-mounted dials, a manual handbrake and Recaro seats, although the ones in the Mark III are just the normal sport seats, not the buckets. Everything in the Mark III is slightly more curvy and more calming to be around over long distances. In the back, the Mark III wins purely by being a 5-door car, but the amount of space is fairly similar once you're in. The boot, however, is miles bigger on the older Mark II. At 385 litres, it dwarfs the 260 litre boot in the Mark III. Most of the loss in space is due to the all-wheel drive system. Let's now get on the road and see how they compare. So how do the Mark II and Mark III Focus RS compare? Well, apart from the big differences like the engine and the all-wheel drive system, the ethos of the cars is still there. The personality is fairly similar when it comes to the chassis. They're still B-road brutes. Although personally the sound of this one sounds better to me. We're going to start with the driving and then do the boring stuff on the way back. But as you can see, even coming out of junctions, that quaife diff really works its magic. Do you need the all-wheel drive system for the Ford Focus Mark III? Not necessarily, but when we get to the driving of that, you'll see why the handling is slightly better. As magical as this diff is, when you're coming around corners and you put your foot down, if you're going a lot faster than the speed limit obviously, you'll tend to find the car plows straight on just a tad. It's nowhere near as bad as its VAG counterparts like the VW Golf R or the Audi S3, but you'll notice that the slightly newer Focus, because of the rear drive bias, especially when you're in drift mode, it just hooks up a little bit more in the corners. There's no denying though that the personality of this Mark II is slightly more aggressive. I think that's the right word. The engine is slightly more throaty and less snappy almost. I like to think of this car as a bouncer, but with actual skill when it comes to fighting. The skill is the diff, but it's got that brute behind it to really push the car along the road. And the bangs you get out the exhaust, there's no mistaking, they are better than the newer car. The suspension on the two cars does feel different. The newer one is actually slightly stiffer, believe it or not. The steering still has a fairly similar personality actually, even though they're fairly different mechanically. Last week we did actually review this Mark II, so if you'd like to see that review by itself, just click in the top right hand corner up here. And we also actually reviewed the Focus RS Mark III by itself as well. So I'll put another link up there as well so you can watch that car. Overall, in terms of driving dynamics, of course this one feels slightly older, slightly more mechanical, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. Sometimes when the car is slightly more raucous from the steering wheel and from underneath you, it can be slightly more enjoyable. Important things like the gear shift and the actual accuracy of the steering are just as good as the newer car. The only difference I noticed is that the gear shift in the newer car is slightly less notchy, although that can be due to the fact this car has got a plethora of upgrades that I'll put on the screen now. And as you can see, the Sachs clutch and flywheel can always change how things feel slightly. Certainly the weight of the clutch is a lot heavier, but having said that, once you're used to it, it's quite good. The bite point is really, really profound, and stalling this car is actually a pretty difficult thing to do. It also means if you want a flat foot shift, you can do it really quickly, especially from third to fourth. But from second to third, the car doesn't like to do it really, really fast. You have to give it a little bit of time. So it means if you're doing draggy runs or anything like that, it takes a little bit more time to shift gears. Whilst we're stationary, I may as well talk about the price of the two cars. Surprisingly, this is the more expensive one. That's obviously because these cars are quite rare. I mean, even when they were brand new, 11,000 were made worldwide, only 4,000 sent to the UK. So although that sounds like a large number, when you take in, you know, a whole population, it's not actually that massive. And after all these things get crashed or modified or yada yada yada, these cars start to become quite expensive. And as well as the rarity, of course, the car itself is really good to drive. That's why people want them in the first place. They're proper driver's cars. And on a B road, you can tell the chassis is much more racy than something like a VW Golf R. So the price of this car now is £40,000, which is a lot of moolah. But when you consider the rarity and you consider the fact it's probably going to keep going up in value, to be honest, it doesn't seem like such a bad purchase. Remember, if you bought a brand new Golf R, you'd be paying about the same price, and then the value of that car is just going to tank straight away. So you're going to lose about 40% of the value of the car over 4 years. Whereas this, you could buy it, drive it 10, 20,000 miles, and maybe even make a profit when you sell it. In terms of the Mark III, you're looking at about £28,000 to £30,000 on those cars. And again, it's a lot of money, but the same thing applies. These Focus RS cars seem to either hold their value or increase their value. After the initial 4 or 5 years that they're out, they start to climb, and they never seem to go down again. They seem to go pretty much all the way up to about £100,000 and then just stay there. So if you're looking at buying one of these cars, don't be too scared about the price tag. It's not as intimidating as it first looks. In terms of motorway driving, the cars are fairly similar. The main difference you notice is the suspension in this feels slightly softer, whereas the Mark III, it's still quite stiff even in its comfort setting. But things like road noise and wind noise, they're fairly similar. The Mark III does have a little bit more refinement when it comes to the wind noise though. visibility at the cars is actually quite different. This older Mark II has slightly better view out the front. It feels like the windscreen is slightly lower into the bonnet, and the view out the sides is definitely better in the Mark II. Because this is a 3-door car, you get much bigger windows on the sides of the car, so it means checking your blind spot and things like that much easier in this compared to the Mark III. The Mark III, the B pillar is quite close to your head, as is the same with pretty much any 5-door hatchback, so checking your blind spot can be a little bit more difficult. In terms of which car I'd rather be in on a long journey, I'd probably just about say the Mark III. Obviously, because it's the newer car, it's slightly more refined, the air conditioning is slightly more powerful in that car, and the standard sport seats in the Mark III are actually pretty comfortable on a long journey. Whereas these Recaros, whilst they hug you very well, and they are comfortable for what they are just slightly too sporty if you're going to spend more than about 4 hours in it. Of course, the biggest difference on the inside is the different design, and whilst you can still see it's obviously a Ford on the inside of the newer car, the Mark III has quite a lot better quality when it comes to just the material choices. There's nothing wrong with this Mark II, in fact it's still got squidgy material on the dash, but it's things like the door cards, this is all plastic, and you got plastic here, plastic here. The only bit of cool looking trim you get is this carbon fibre effect stuff. But of course you're not buying these cars for the way they look inside, you're buying them because they drive well. So let's now hop into the Mark III and see how that does. Okay, now we're in the Mark III and let's jump straight into the driving. The first thing you notice is the chassis itself feels slightly more delicate. The springs are harder, and there's a lot more intake noise. A lot of that is due to the AirTech intake though. Although having said that, the Mark II does have one of those. We're just in normal mode at the moment, so the suspension's in its least stiff setting, and I think for UK roads that's probably the best setting to be in. Although the race setting isn't actually that bad. It is stiff, but you know, if you want to really go quickly on a B road, it's there if you need it. The steering has a little bit more feel to it. It's very slightly heavier, although the overall feel is quite the same. They've just basically made it slightly more direct. The response of the engine is also slightly better. The flywheel's lighter in this car, so when you're not in gear and you rev the engine, it revs much quicker than the older 2.5 litre. So there's a lot less feeling of lag. One thing you notice pretty quickly in this is the gear shift itself is quite different. And obviously, as I mentioned before, having the lighter flywheel, it makes it quite a lot easier to rev match. So if we change our drive mode into sport, this will just sharpen up the response of the whole car. And second gear will get you pretty much all the way to 60. And the pops and bangs are just as loud with a stock exhaust. They're almost more snappy, whereas the ones in the Mark II Focus are more like they're going to spit fire. These are kind of a hollow pop. But that's the advantage of the all-wheel drive system. Whilst the quaif diff in the Mark II is very good for what it is, it's still front-wheel drive. So an all-wheel drive system with torque vectoring at the rear just makes this car absolutely rapid at lower speeds. And one thing I'd also like to note is when you're actually on it and you're driving quickly on a B road or wherever you're driving, the fuel economy is pretty much identical. It's only when you're off boost, this car becomes quite a lot more efficient than its older counterpart. Coming onto the motorway, the one thing you notice is these cars are actually pretty similar in terms of road noise and wind noise. Where they start to differ is interior quality. So you get slightly more squidgier materials on the door cards. The dash also is a bit more squidgy, and there's more of it as well. Everything's got a slightly more curvier line to it, and even the plastics that are hard are slightly better quality than that of the Mark IIs. Even everything down to the buttons are damped slightly differently. It just feels like a slightly more premium product. And when you are on the motorway, the suspension of the Mark III seems to settle down quite a lot, whereas the Mark II is slightly more choppy over those bigger bumps. And even when you are going down faster B roads, although the Mark III is certainly stiffer, it rounds off those bumps quite a lot better than the Mark II does. Although having said that, that could just be from the fact the Mark II is 11 years old. As I mentioned before, the gear shifts are slightly different. They're slightly more accurate in this Mark III. Again, that could be just wear and tear in the Mark II. But this car seems to have a slightly notchier, more accurate mechanical feel to it, allowing you to shift quicker. And that, combined with a lighter flywheel and a faster revving engine, allows you to change gears just that little bit quicker. Although even saying that, as you saw before, the Mark II is quite a fair amount faster when it comes to the 30 to 70 sprint. A lot of that is down to the fact the Mark II is modded and it does have more power, so it should be quicker. But remember to take into account drivetrain loss. This has got a very complex all-wheel drive system, which takes up quite a lot of horsepower just to use. So this car would need at least 400 horsepower to match the time of the Mark II. Then when it comes to excitement, they do it in a very different way actually, even though they're technically both Focus RX cars. Because of the different chassis, the different suspension setup, and the powertrain, the Mark II is kind of like a brick on wheels that gets pulled around. You know, it's scrabbling for grip. It's quite a lot like a Bulldog. Whereas the Mark III is slightly more refined. It's more nuanced in the way it goes around a corner, and there's a bit more to learn when it comes to the chassis and the all-wheel drive system. And although this Mark III is almost as brutish when it comes to a B-road blast, there is something about the Mark II that is just a little bit more thrilling. Maybe having slightly worse steering and slightly less accurate feel to the front end is what makes it more exciting, purely because it gets your heart rate up. But you can't go wrong with either two of these cars. Both of them are going to go up in value in the future, and I truly believe that these are some of the best hot hatches you can buy right now. What it comes down to is, if you want something slightly more modern, it's got Bluetooth audio, you'd go for one of these. Whereas if you want something slightly more visceral, slightly more hard-edged, you'd go for the Mark II. Well, although this review's been quite short, I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, give it a like, and why not subscribe to our channel. Not only can you see more of these types of videos, you'll also be able to see all the stock we put online. That includes the Mark II and this Mark III. I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.